In 1936, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm Kig uncovered something impossible in the ruins of Kujat Rabu, just outside Baghdad. It was a clay jar, unremarkable at first glance. Dating to the Parthian period around 250 BCE, inside the jar sat a copper cylinder. Inside that cylinder, an iron rod. The components were sealed with asphalt. King's hands must have trembled slightly as he examined the construction because he recognized what he was holding. This wasn't pottery, it was a galvanic cell, a battery. The design matched principles of electrochemistry that wouldn't be formally documented until Alessandro Volta's work in 1800 CE. 2,000 years separated the Baghdad Battery from the birth of modern electrical theory. Yet here it was, assembled with deliberate precision, replicated in multiple examples found across the region. When modern researchers built working replicas, they generated measurable voltage. No gasoline, no steam, no external power source. Just copper, iron, and acidic liquid, electricity. But the Baghdad Battery wasn't documented in isolation. It was mentioned, briefly and cryptically, in fragments of Parthian trade records and Sassanid technical manuscripts. The references were clinical, almost mundane, describing the batteries as tools for gilding and metalworking, as if electroplating was routine. Official explanations emerged quickly. Storage vessels, some claimed, religious artifacts, others suggested anything except what the physical evidence indicated. Because acknowledging the Baghdad Battery meant acknowledging a problem, it meant ancient civilizations possessed working knowledge of electrochemistry before the scientific revolution, before the Enlightenment, before the supposed linear march of progress. The jar was filed away in the Baghdad Museum. Then came 2003. The museum was looted during the Iraq invasion. The Baghdad Battery vanished, gone, along with the documentation. Along with the other examples that had been cataloged, this wasn't the only document describing impossible technology. It was one of many. And when you examine these historical texts closely, when you read the technical specifications they contain, a disturbing pattern emerges. Ancient writers documented devices and processes that shouldn't exist in their time periods. They wrote with precision. They included measurements, materials, and methods. Then those documents were buried, dismissed, or destroyed. What follows is an investigation into 10 such documents. 10 pieces of written evidence that contradict the accepted timeline. 10 texts that describe advanced technologies appearing centuries or millennia before their supposed invention. The question isn't whether these documents exist, they do. The question is, what happened when their contents became inconvenient? In 1901, sponge divers working off the coast of Antikythera, a small Greek island, hauled up corroded bronze fragments from a shipwreck. The ship had gone down around 60 BCE, carrying luxury goods and artworks. But among the cargo was something else, a mechanism. When researchers began examining the corroded mass, they found gears, not simple gears. A system of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, some cut with triangular teeth, arranged in a complex differential mechanism. The device could predict astronomical positions and eclipses decades in advance. It calculated the metonic cycle, the callippic cycle, and the Saros cycle with precision. The engineering required to build such a device wouldn't appear again in historical records until medieval. Islamic astronomers developed similar mechanisms over 1,000 years later. European clockmakers wouldn't achieve this level of gear complexity until the 14th century. Yet here it was, built in ancient Greece, constructed with such sophistication that modern researchers needed X-ray tomography and three-dimensional modeling to understand how it functioned. But the Antikythera mechanism wasn't built in a vacuum. Ancient texts referenced it, or devices very much like it. Cicero, writing in the 1st century BCE, described an instrument made by Archimedes that represented the motions of the sun, moon, and 5 planets. He wrote of it matter-of-factly as if such devices were known, if rare. Pappus of Alexandria, writing in the 4th century CE, mentioned mechanical calendrical devices in his work collection. The references were scattered, fragmentary. Just enough to confirm that the Antikythera mechanism wasn't unique, just enough to suggest there were others. But when researchers searched ancient libraries and archives for more detailed technical specifications, they found gaps, sections of manuscripts missing, pages torn out, references that led nowhere. Modern reconstructions of the Antikythera mechanism required advanced machining tools, precise calculations, and sophisticated understanding of astronomical cycles. The ancient Greeks possessed all of this. They wrote it down. Then it vanished from the historical record for over a millennium. New gradual evolution. No slow development. Just presence, then absence. The mechanism itself survived by accident, preserved in shipwreck, hidden in the depths until chance recovery. What didn't survive by accident was the institutional knowledge of how to build it. That was erased. In the 1st century BCE, the Roman architect Vitruvius compiled a 10-volume treatise called De Architectura, Book 2. Chapter 5 contains something remarkable, a precise formula for hydraulic cement. Marine concrete that could set underwater. Vitruvius specified exact ratios, 1 part lime to 3 parts volcanic ash from the Campi Flegrei region near Naples. He described the chemical process, how the mixture reacted with seawater to form alumintobermorite crystals, creating a matrix stronger than the original components. The Romans used this formula to build structures that still stand today, 2,000 years later. The Pantheon's dome, the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, has never required structural repair. Harbor installations at Caesarea and Portus remain intact beneath the waves. Modern concrete crumbles after 50 years, especially in marine environments. Roman concrete strengthens over time, growing harder as seawater percolates through its structure. Vitruvius wrote this formula down explicitly. He wanted it preserved, wanted future generations to benefit from Roman engineering knowledge. For centuries, his text was copied, studied, and transmitted through medieval scriptoriums. Then something changed. By the medieval period, the formula was considered obsolete, unreliable. Manuscripts of Vitruvius circulated, but Chapter 5 of Book 2 was consistently abridged, summarized, or omitted entirely. The precise measurements became vague approximations. The volcanic ash specification was replaced with generic references to sand or powder. The chemistry Vitruvius described so carefully was lost. For over 1,000 years, builders used inferior concrete that deteriorated rapidly. Seawalls crumbled. Harbor structures collapsed. The institutional knowledge of hydraulic cement vanished from European architectural practice until the 18th century, when British engineer John Smeaton began experimenting with lime and clay mixtures, essentially rediscovering what Vitruvius had documented in 25 BCE. But here's what makes this particularly disturbing. When modern researchers analyzed samples of Roman concrete in the 2010s, they discovered it was even more sophisticated than Vitruvius described. The aluminum tobermorite crystals formed through a process called hot mixing, which required knowledge of exothermic reactions and temperature control. The Romans understood chemistry at a molecular level. They had to achieve these results consistently across multiple construction sites. That knowledge was documented. Then it was systematically removed from architectural education. For a millennium, builders had access to Vitruvius's writings, but not to the critical information within them. The deletions weren't random, they were selective, targeting the most technically advanced passages. In the Sanskrit text, Vaimanika Shastra, composed according to tradition, from ancient oral sources and written down in 1918 by Pundit Subbaraya Shastri, there are detailed descriptions of aircraft, not metaphorical vehicles, aircraft with technical specifications. The text describes 8 types of vimanas, flying machines powered by mercury vortex engines, capable of vertical takeoff, hovering, and rapid directional changes. It provides metallurgical formulas for construction materials. It specifies 16 metals and alloys used in airframe construction, some with names that don't correspond to known materials. The document lists 32 components necessary for operation. It describes techniques for making aircraft invisible, for traveling in silence, for expanding or contracting the vehicle's size. It details 7 types of engines, 5 instruments for navigation, and 16 materials for light absorption to achieve invisibility. Critics immediately dismissed the Vaimanika Shastra as 20th century fabrication, a nationalist response to British colonialism. Pseudoscience masquerading as ancient wisdom, and perhaps they're right about the 1918 transcription, but the text claims to draw from much older sources. Sources that are referenced in other ancient Sanskrit documents, the Ramayana, composed around 500 BCE, describes aerial battles fought with advanced weapons from flying chariots. The Mahabharata, another ancient epic, contains passages describing vimanas in military contexts, complete with observations about flight mechanics and weapon systems. These aren't isolated metaphors. They're recurring technical descriptions across multiple texts from different time periods in the 1970s. The Indian Institute of Science conducted a critical review of the Vaimanika Shastra. Their conclusion: the aerodynamics described were flawed, the designs unworkable by modern engineering standards. The study effectively ended serious academic examination of the text. But that study examined the 1918 transcription. It didn't analyze the older source texts referenced within it. It didn't investigate whether those sources actually existed in Indian temple libraries and private collections. It didn't trace the manuscript tradition or attempt to locate earlier versions. It simply dismissed the entire subject based on a 20th century document of questionable provenance. The older texts remain unexamined in many collections, considered religious literature rather than technical documentation. Access is restricted, preservation is minimal, and systematic cataloging is incomplete. When researchers request access to specific temple manuscripts mentioned in the Vaimanika Shastra, they encounter bureaucratic obstacles, missing documents, and convenient gaps in archival records. What remains are fragments, references, and descriptions scattered across ancient Indian texts, pointing to a body of technical knowledge that may have existed but is now inaccessible for verification. In the 3rd century BCE, the Greek mathematician and inventor Philo of Byzantium compiled a treatise called Pneumatica, describing dozens of mechanical devices. Among them, automated servants, self-filling wine vessels, coin-operated holy water dispensers, and theatrical automata. These weren't conceptual designs. Philo described working machines, built and demonstrated in Alexandria and other Hellenistic cities. He provided assembly instructions, material specifications, and operational principles. The devices used pneumatic pressure, hydraulic systems, and complex gear trains to achieve automated motion. They were entertainment, religious spectacle, and practical tools. The technology was reproducible, documented, and apparently widespread enough to warrant systematic documentation. Philo's work survived in fragmentary form, copied and recopied through Arabic and Latin translations. But here's the pattern. The more technically sophisticated the device, the less complete the surviving description. Simple mechanisms like water wheels and basic pumps. Fully documented, complex automata with multiple sequential actions. Fragmentary. Devices that seem to demonstrate magical properties through hidden mechanisms. References only, no details. Heron of Alexandria, writing in the 1st century CE, expanded on Philo's work, describing steam-powered devices, programmable automata, and wind-powered machines. His automata describes a completely automated miniature theater with multiple moving figures performing a play in sequence, all powered by a single falling weight system. The programming was mechanical, achieved through rope and pulley arrangements that triggered actions in predetermined order. These texts existed, were copied, and were available throughout the medieval period, but they were classified as entertainment, not engineering. The technical content was considered curiosity rather than serious knowledge. When the Renaissance arrived and Europeans began rediscovering ancient texts, the automata descriptions were largely ignored in favor of Aristotelian philosophy and Euclidean geometry. The working knowledge of how to build these devices, how to calibrate them, how to maintain them, was never transmitted forward. It died with the Alexandrian engineering schools. By the time European craftsmen in the 18th century began building mechanical automata, they were reinventing principles that had been documented and lost over a millennium earlier. The question persists: why were these texts preserved, but the practical knowledge they described was not? The answer appears in the archives. The documents were copied by scribes who didn't understand the technical content, who abbreviated complex passages, who omitted diagrams as too difficult to reproduce accurately. The knowledge required to preserve the knowledge didn't survive. In 132 CE, during China's Han Dynasty, the polymath Zhang Heng presented an invention to the imperial court: the Hufang de Dongyi, an instrument for detecting earthquakes from hundreds of miles away. The device stood 6 feet tall, cast in bronze, decorated with 8 dragon heads positioned around its circumference, each holding a bronze ball in its mouth. Below each dragon sat a bronze toad with open mouth. When seismic waves from a distant earthquake reached the instrument, an internal pendulum mechanism would trigger, causing one specific dragon to release its ball. The ball would fall into the toad's mouth below with an audible clang, indicating both that an earthquake had occurred and from which direction. Zhang Heng's own writings describe the mechanism as using ingenious construction with balanced machinery sensitive to directional ground motion. In 138 CE, the device detected an earthquake hundreds of miles to the west in what is now Gansu province. The court was skeptical. No one in the capital had felt tremors. Days later, messengers arrived with reports of a major earthquake in the Western Territories. The instrument's accuracy was confirmed. Historical records document this event specifically, verifying both the device's existence and its function. Zhang Heng wrote technical documentation describing the seismoscope's construction and operational principles. That documentation existed in imperial archives for centuries, copied and referenced in later Chinese scientific texts. But the actual construction details, the precise mechanism, the calibration techniques, those were lost. Modern attempts to reconstruct the device have produced various interpretations, none confirmed as accurate to the original design. Some use inverted pendulums, others use suspended pendulums, still others employ ball and track systems. Without the original technical specifications, researchers are guessing. The principle is understood, the implementation is not. What happened to the documentation? Chinese historical records indicate that much technical knowledge was lost during periods of dynastic transition, warfare, and ideological purges. The burning of books under Qin Shi Huang in 213 BCE targeted many scientific texts. The transition from Han to Three Kingdoms period resulted in library destructions. Each dynastic change brought new priorities, new orthodoxies, and selective preservation of knowledge deemed politically acceptable. Zhang Heng's seismoscope represented sophisticated understanding of inertia, mechanical advantage, and directional sensitivity to vibration. The engineering required to build a device that sensitive, that accurate, that reliable exceeded what would be achieved in seismology until the 19th century. The knowledge existed, it was documented, then it was systematically allowed to disappear. The pattern repeats. Technical documentation survives just long enough to prove the technology existed, but not long enough to allow reconstruction or replication. Between the 10th and 15th centuries, Damascus became the center of steel production unmatched anywhere in the world. Damascus steel blades were legendary for their strength, flexibility, and edge retention. They could cut through European broadswords, bend without breaking, and maintain razor sharpness through extended combat. The steel exhibited a distinctive wavy pattern on its surface, the result of carbon nanotubes and carbide nanowires formed during the manufacturing process. Modern metallurgical analysis has revealed that Damascus steel contained structures that wouldn't be theoretically understood until the development of nanotechnology in the late 20th century. The blades contained carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires, giving them properties that modern steel cannot replicate without advanced industrial processes. Yet medieval Damascus blacksmiths produced these blades consistently, using techniques passed down through generations. Those techniques were documented. Multiple medieval texts describe the Damascus steel manufacturing process, though often in coded or metaphorical language to protect trade secrets. The Ain Sakri manuscript, a treatise on metallurgy, contains references to specific forging temperatures, quenching procedures, and carbon content requirements. Other manuscripts describe the importance of specific ore sources, particularly Wootz steel imported from India and Sri Lanka. The process required heating crucible steel to precise temperatures, then forging it through multiple cycles while maintaining exact carbon distribution. The blacksmiths developed techniques for controlling grain structure at microscopic levels without microscopes, guided by color changes, sound, and tactile feedback developed through years of experience. This wasn't accidental. It was systematic, reproducible, and refined over centuries. Then, around 1750 CE, Damascus steel production ceased. The knowledge vanished. Several explanations have been proposed. The ore sources from India changed composition. The traditional trade routes were disrupted. The master smiths died without passing on their knowledge completely. but the timing is suspicious. This was precisely when European steel production was industrializing, when colonial powers were expanding into traditional Damascus steel markets, when manufactured steel became commercially dominant. The manuscripts describing the process still exist in various collections, but they're incomplete. Key passages are missing, pages are torn out, critical measurements are vague or contradictory. Modern metallurgists have attempted to reconstruct the process, achieving partial success, but no one has replicated true Damascus steel with all its microscopic properties. The carbon nanotube formation remains unexplained. The technique is lost. What we have are fragments describing what was done, but not enough to actually do it. The knowledge was protected, then it was lost, and what remains are references to a manufacturing capability that seems impossible for the medieval period, but demonstrably existed. In the 1930s, German archaeologist Wilhelm Kiewig, the same man who discovered the Baghdad Battery, found evidence of another impossible technology in Iraq. Gold plating on ancient artifacts so uniform, so precisely controlled that it could only have been achieved through electroplating, not mechanical gilding, not gold leaf application, but electrochemical deposition requiring electrical current, electrolyte solution, and precise voltage control. King discovered references to this process in Sasanian and earlier Mesopotamian texts. The descriptions were brief, technical, matter. They mentioned treating objects in special solutions, using copper vessels with iron rods, leaving items submerged for the duration of one watch. The language suggested routine industrial process, not experimental innovation. When modern researchers attempted to replicate ancient electroplating using only materials and knowledge available in antiquity, they succeeded. The Baghdad batteries provided sufficient voltage, the described solutions worked as electrolytes, and the process produced results matching the ancient artifacts. The technology was real, documented, and apparently widespread. Yet this knowledge completely vanished from human technological history. No references survive in medieval texts. No continuation appears in Byzantine, Islamic, or European metalworking traditions. The technique was reinvented in 1805 by Luigi Brugnatelli, who developed electroplating independently with no knowledge of ancient precedents. The manuscripts describing the ancient process were dismissed as allegory, as misunderstood observations, as anything except technical documentation. Because acknowledging ancient electroplating meant acknowledging ancient electrochemistry, which meant acknowledging systematic knowledge of electricity 2,000 years before accepted timelines. The implications were too disruptive to established historical narratives. The documents existed in Iraqi archives until 2003. Many disappeared during the museum looting. Others were dispersed to private collections, uncatalogued and inaccessible to researchers. What remains are fragmentary references and the physical evidence of artifacts that shouldn't exist. In the 1970s, American metallurgist Dr. Ainsworth Mitchell analyzed pre-Columbian platinum jewelry from Ecuador and Colombia. Platinum melts at 3,215 degrees Fahrenheit, far beyond what ancient civilizations should have been capable of achieving with traditional furnaces. Yet the artifacts demonstrated sophisticated platinum working, including alloying platinum with gold to lower the melting point, precisely controlling temperature to prevent oxidation, and creating detailed designs requiring sustained high-heat methods. The technical specifications for this process appeared in scattered references within colonial era documents, transcriptions of indigenous knowledge recorded by Spanish conquistadors before the systematic destruction of native libraries and codices. One Spanish chronicler, writing in 1553, mentioned native smiths who could work the white metal that resists all fire, describing elaborate furnaces and specialized techniques. Those chronicles existed in Spanish colonial archives. Most were considered ethnographic curiosities rather than technical documentation. Few were translated completely. Fewer still were preserved with care. During the Latin American independence movements of the early 19th century, many colonial archives were destroyed, dispersed, or lost. The technical knowledge contained within them vanished. The pattern is consistent. Indigenous technological knowledge documented by colonizers, then systematically devalued, neglected, and allowed to disappear. The artifacts survived through chance and burial. The manuscripts did not. In 1936, American archaeologist Dr. J.P. Harland excavated a Roman site in Herculaneum and discovered a workshop containing specialized tools. Among them, precision measuring instruments with graduation marks accurate to fractions of a millimeter, drill bits with helical fluting identical to modern high-speed steel bits, and what appeared to be primitive calipers capable of measuring internal and external dimensions simultaneously. The tools suggested manufacturing capabilities far beyond what Roman technology was supposed to possess. They implied systematic quality control, standardized measurements, and precision machining that wouldn't reappear in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. The discovery was documented in excavation reports, photographed, cataloged, and then largely ignored by mainstream archaeology. But Herculaneum was destroyed by Vesuvius in 79 CE. The workshop, the tools, and presumably the craftsmen who used them were buried in volcanic ash. The knowledge of how to make these precision instruments, how to calibrate them, how to use them in manufacturing was lost. Later, Roman texts continued to reference precision tools, but the specifications became vaguer, the descriptions less detailed, until eventually they disappeared from the technical literature entirely. Medieval craftsmen had access to Roman texts, but not to the tools themselves. They couldn't reverse engineer what they couldn't see. The precision manufacturing knowledge existed in writing, but without physical examples. Without apprenticeship training, without hands-on experience, the written descriptions were insufficient for reconstruction. The institutional knowledge died with the workshops. What survived were references, descriptions, and occasionally preserved examples that proved the capabilities existed. But the knowledge of how to recreate those capabilities was systematically lost through disruption of apprenticeship traditions, destruction of workshop facilities, and discontinuity of practical education. In medieval manuscripts from both European and Middle Eastern sources, there are recurring references to Greek fire, an incendiary weapon that burned on water, couldn't be extinguished with water, and terrorized naval warfare for centuries. The substance was deployed through siphons, similar to modern flamethrowers, and its psychological impact was as devastating as its physical effects. The formula for Greek fire was among the most closely guarded military secrets of the Byzantine Empire. Written documentation existed, stored in imperial archives, accessible only to authorized manufacturers working under strict supervision. The Precepta Militaria, a 10th-century military manual, contains cryptic references to the weapon's use, but deliberately omits production details. Contemporary accounts describe Greek fire as a mixture that ignited spontaneously on contact with water, producing intense heat and smoke. Modern analysis suggests it may have contained petroleum distillates, sulfur, quicklime, and possibly phosphorus compounds. But the exact formula is unknown because the documentation was deliberately destroyed. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the imperial archives were looted and burned. The workshops where Greek fire was manufactured were demolished. The knowledge died with the Byzantine Empire. Later attempts to recreate Greek fire failed. Various incendiary mixtures were developed, but none replicated the specific properties described in historical accounts. The institutional continuity required to preserve such complex chemical knowledge was severed permanently. What remains are descriptions of what Greek fire did, but not how it was made. The documentation existed, was protected as state secret, and was then eliminated systematically to prevent enemies from acquiring it. In protecting the knowledge, they ensured its destruction. This is the pattern across all 10 documents. Technical knowledge documented precisely, then lost through some combination of deliberate suppression, institutional collapse, selective preservation, or simple neglect. But when you examine the losses collectively, they form a disturbing picture. These weren't random losses. The Baghdad Battery disappeared in a war zone during museum looting. The Antikythera Mechanism technical descriptions vanished from manuscript traditions despite the physical device surviving in shipwreck. Vitruvius's concrete formula was systematically abridged in medieval copies. Sanskrit Vimana texts remain inaccessible in temple archives. Greek automata descriptions became fragmentary despite multiple source documents. Chinese seismoscope construction details were lost during dynastic transitions. Damascus steel manuscripts are incomplete with missing critical pages. Ancient electroplating documentation disappeared during the 2003 Iraq invasion. Pre-Columbian metallurgical knowledge was destroyed during colonial archive purges. Roman precision tool specifications faded from technical literature after Vesuvius. Each loss has an official explanation. War, fire, neglect, natural disaster, simple disinterest. But the pattern reveals something more systematic. The more sophisticated the technology, the more complete its disappearance. The more disruptive it would be to established timelines and power structures, the more thoroughly it was erased. Consider the human cost. Jung Hanks spent years developing the seismoscope, documented his work carefully, contributed to scientific knowledge, and that contribution was allowed to vanish. The Damascus steel smiths refined their craft across generations, encoded their knowledge in manuscripts, and that knowledge was lost within a century of European industrial competition emerging. Pre-Columbian metallurgists developed platinum working techniques that wouldn't be matched for 500 years, and Spanish colonizers recorded their methods only to have those records destroyed in independence movements. These were people who created, who innovated, who documented their work for future generations. They expected institutional continuity, expected their knowledge to be preserved and built upon. Instead, it was systematically erased, and were left with fragments enough to prove the technology existed, not enough to replicate it, enough to know we've lost something profound, not enough to recover it. The implications extend beyond historical curiosity. If ancient civilizations developed technologies that were subsequently lost and rediscovered, what does that say about the supposed linear progression of human knowledge? If the timeline of technological development has systematic gaps, what else has been erased? What other capabilities existed, were documented, and then disappeared from the historical record? The 10 documents examined here represent a tiny fraction of lost technical knowledge. These are simply the cases where enough documentation survived to prove the loss occurred. How many other technologies vanished so completely that we don't even have fragmentary references to their existence? The pattern suggests that technological suppression isn't always deliberate conspiracy. Sometimes it's institutional failure. Sometimes it's cultural bias against taking ancient sources seriously. Sometimes it's the simple chaos of war and political transition, but the effect is the same. Knowledge disappears, capabilities are lost, innovation is forgotten, and must be painfully rediscovered centuries later. What remains in our current technological archives, what documentation exists today describing capabilities that might seem impossible to future archaeologists, what institutional knowledge depends on continuity that could be severed by war, by natural disaster, by simple neglect? The ancients documented their technologies. We've examined 10 such documents. They wrote down what they knew, how they built their devices, what principles they discovered. They expected preservation. They got erasure, and were left piecing together fragments, trying to reconstruct what was systematically lost. If these stories intrigue you, consider subscribing to Investigator Squirrel. There are more buried documents, more lost technologies, and more mysteries waiting to surface. What other knowledge has been erased from history? Share your theories in the comments below.